In 1996, a 6-year-old boy named Daniel Whitaker disappeared without a trace from a crowded grocery store in Cedar Falls, Iowa. His mother stepped away for just 2 minutes to grab a carton of milk when she turned around. Daniel was gone. No witnesses, no evidence, just a single red mitten left on the floor. For 22 years, his name haunted missing posters and cold case files. But when a new cashier accidentally knocked over a shelving unit, what they found hidden behind it unraveled a mystery darker than anyone imagined. The automatic doors hissed open as the Whitaker family stepped into the fluorescent-lit warmth of the Granger's Market. It was the kind of place every family in Cedar Falls went to on weekends, aisles crammed with produce bins, cereal boxes stacked to the ceiling, familiar jingles playing softly through the ceiling speakers. The air smelled like oranges, wet cardboard, and something fried from the deli in the back. Margaret pushed the cart with one hand, Daniel's small fingers curled tightly around the other. It was their Saturday ritual. James trailed behind, flipping through the local sports section he'd grabbed from a display up front. Daniel, just 6, had a habit of skipping along beside his mother, humming to himself and pointing out the cartoon characters on the cereal boxes. He wore his red winter coat despite the warming weather and had insisted on bringing his mittened hands just in case it snowed in the freezer aisle. One mitten dangled from the sleeve by a string, the other snug around his fist. Margaret had bent down near the dairy section, eyes scanning the rows of milk cartons, murmuring to herself, "Whole milk, 2%, skim." Daniel's hand slipped from hers. It wasn't unusual he would often hover a few feet away, still in sight. But when she stood and turned, he wasn't there. "Danny?" she called, scanning the aisle. No answer. A middle-aged woman in a green coat passed by with a cart, offering a polite smile. Margaret moved faster now, pushing the cart aside and walking briskly toward the end of the aisle. "Daniel, honey, where are you?" Her voice pitched higher. A man glanced up from the frozen pizza section. Still nothing. She retraced her steps, heart thudding, eyes darting down each row. By the time she reached James near the cereal display, her voice had cracked. "He's gone," she said, her voice shaking. "I looked away for a second, and no, he's not there." The store manager was called. The building was locked down. Over the intercom, a calm but urgent voice echoed through the aisles. "Attention shoppers, we are experiencing a brief security situation. Please remain where you are until further notice." Margaret's hands trembled as she held up Daniel's mitten found near the corner of aisle 7, limp and abandoned like a forgotten toy. Somewhere behind her, James stood paralyzed, still clutching the newspaper in his hands, unread and now utterly meaningless. Outside, the Iowa sky had clouded over. Snow did not fall, but a silence settled over the town that would last far longer than winter. The scent of lemons and ammonia hung heavy in the air as investigators moved silently through Granger's Market, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional creak of a rolling evidence cart or the muffled click of a Polaroid camera. By then, the store had been cleared, customers escorted out, employees gathered in the break room, the doors sealed shut under orders from the Cedar Falls Police Department. It had been nearly 2 hours since Daniel Whitaker vanished, and already the fluorescent light of the store felt harsher, colder, as if it knew something sacred had been lost there. Officer Lillian Hart stood at the end of aisle 7, staring down at the small red mitten lying near the base of a bottom shelf. The way it was placed angled slightly. Fingers splayed as if it had fallen mid-movement sent a chill through her. She didn't touch it. Instead, she crouched down and examined the floor. Clean. Too clean. Not a single fingerprint, no drag marks, no scuffed shoe prints, not even a sign of hesitation in the surrounding tile. "Any sign of struggle?" a voice asked from behind her. Detective Mark Rourke stepped into view, his coat still damp from the snow outside. He looked tired already. Hart stood, shaking her head. "Nothing," she replied. "One mitten, that's it." Rourke knelt beside it, his breath fogging faintly in the refrigerated air that bled from the nearby cooler case. He looked closely at the edges of the mitten, then around the shelves. There were cans of soup nearby, some slightly misaligned. One leaned like it had been nudged, but not fallen. No blood, no hair, no fibers. He stood slowly. This isn't right. The store manager, a nervous man in his 40s named Ed Kramer, hovered nearby with red-rimmed eyes. "We've checked every camera. System rebooted the feeds this morning after a storm. Half of them didn't come back on. Aisle 7's dead." Hart's jaw clenched. "Of course it is." They took the mitten into evidence, sealed in a plastic bag labeled with a time and case number. Margaret refused to let go of its twin. She held it tightly in the waiting area, rocking slowly, whispering Daniel's name with each breath. Outside, the snow had started again thin, hesitant flakes dancing down from the gray sky. The town would never forget that mitten. It would be the first detail printed on every flyer, the lead in every broadcast. Not the color of Daniel's coat, not the sound of his laugh. But the red mitten on the floor of aisle 7, the only thing he left behind? The soft chime of the store intercom had barely faded when panic truly set in. Granger's Market, once filled with the mundane chatter of weekend shoppers and the clatter of carts, now sat in uneasy silence. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like distant insects. Margaret Whitaker's voice echoed off the tiled floor. "Daniel!" Her cries were no longer tentative, no longer seeking, they were pleading. A mother's voice unspooling at the edges, shrill and cracking with desperation. Aisles were searched once, then again. Employees combed every shelf, every freezer case, calling his name as if he might suddenly appear between the applesauce and the instant oatmeal. James stood uselessly near the registers, pale, his mouth open slightly as if frozen mid-sentence. One of the cashiers tried to comfort him, placing a hand on his shoulder, but he flinched and stepped away. Manager Ed Kramer turned the keys in the security panel near customer service, initiating lockdown protocols they had practiced but never expected to use. Metal gates descended with a mechanical groan over the front entrance. "Nobody leaves until we find him," he muttered. Police arrived quickly. The flashing red and blue lights lit up the parking lot like Christmas decorations against the white March sky. Inside, Detective Rourke moved through the store like a storm front, methodical, quiet, dangerous in his silence. He ordered an immediate sweep. Stockrooms, bathrooms, freezer lockers, even the roof access. Nothing. The store's security room was small, a closet dressed in wires and humming black boxes. Rourke sat with Officer Hart and a young tech as they reviewed the feed. Footage from that morning played smoothly, shoppers arriving, employees unloading pallets, but just before 2:17 p.m. when Daniel was last seen, the screen flickered. And then, it was gone. "No signal," the tech said, tapping at the monitor. "It goes black for 17 minutes, then jumps ahead. When it comes back, aisle 7's empty." Rourke leaned back, watching the frozen frame. A vacant aisle. No boy. No struggle. Just absence. They checked every other angle. One camera caught Daniel walking in with his parents. Another showed him skipping toward the dairy aisle. But not a single camera caught him leaving. To the world outside the store, Daniel Whitaker had simply stopped existing. By nightfall, the store was evacuated. Shoppers released one by one, names recorded, statements taken. Yellow tape stretched across the doors like a wound dressing. Inside, the only sound was the quiet hum of refrigeration and a single shopping cart left abandoned in aisle 9, one red mitten resting in the lost and found box like a relic no one dared to claim. By Monday morning, Cedar Falls was a different town. The storefronts lining Main Street kept their signs flipped to open, but inside, business had slowed to a crawl. The chatter that normally accompanied coffee orders and hardware sales had turned into low murmurs, eyes darting toward the door every time it swung open. Conversations started and stopped with Daniel's name. "Did you hear they found nothing? Not even a shoe?" "I heard the cameras were erased. Someone did it on purpose." "I won't even let my kids walk to the end of the block." In kitchens, classrooms, barbershops, and churches, the story traveled faster than facts could catch it. At the elementary school, children were no longer allowed to go to the bathroom without an adult escort. Field trips were canceled. Doors that had never been locked now had new deadbolts. Parents who used to wave from car windows were now parking, walking their children in, clinging a little too tightly to their small hands. Flyers went up on every bulletin board, telephone pole, and gas station window. Daniel's school photo, slightly too formal for his age, eyes bright, smile slightly crooked. Missing since March 2, 1996. Last seen at Granger's Market. Please call if you have information. The red mitten was mentioned in every version. Margaret's face appeared on the local news that night, pale and sleepless. Her voice wavered as she pleaded into the camera. Please, if you know anything at all. He's 6 years old. He has a birthmark on his shoulder like a little cloud. He's afraid of the dark. The whole town watched in silence, as if speaking during her broadcast might somehow undo the fragile thread of hope she clung to. At Granger's Market, the lights remained off. Police tape still fluttered in the wind. No one said it aloud, but few wanted the store to reopen. Something had shifted there, something too eerie, too unnatural. Children no longer played unsupervised in the park. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. An old man who drove a white van and sold ice cream during summers was stopped twice in one day. And all the while, no answers came, no updates. Only the silence. The kind that clings to a place, to a town, to its people, the kind that waits. Cedar Falls didn't sleep. It watched. It locked its doors. It whispered. And beneath every word was the same unspoken question: if a child can disappear in broad daylight, in the middle of a store, what else could happen? 2 weeks after Daniel vanished, the Cedar Falls Police Department held a press conference in front of a growing crowd of reporters, microphones clustered like insects on a stand, voices murmuring beneath the gray sky. Detective Rourke stepped up to the podium with a thin folder in his hand and fatigue carved into the lines of his face. "We have a suspect in custody," he announced. "A person of interest who was in the store at the time of the disappearance." The crowd stirred. Questions flew before he finished speaking. "Has the child been found? Who is it? Is it true they confessed?" But there were no confessions, no body, no resolution, just a name. Lyle Hargrove. He was a familiar figure around town, mostly for the wrong reasons. 48 years old, with a limp in his right leg and a habit of muttering to himself as he pushed a shopping cart filled with discarded aluminum cans. He lived in a crumbling duplex on the south end of town and had once been institutionalized for paranoid schizophrenia. He wasn't dangerous, people said, just strange. But in the anxious days after Daniel's disappearance, strange was enough. A cashier at Granger's remembered Lyle had been in the store that day, loitering in the snack aisle. Another shopper claimed he'd seen Lyle near the dairy section, watching the boy. That was all it took. He was picked up just after midnight, barefoot and muttering prayers as officers dragged him from his porch. In custody, he didn't resist. He spoke in riddles, about angels and radio waves, about being followed. When asked about Daniel, he said the boy had wings and flew away. To some, it was enough. A monster had a face. Parents breathed easier, if only for a night. But within 72 hours, he was released. No fingerprints, no evidence. No history of violence. Surveillance footage from that day, what little remained, showed Lyle standing at the vending machine by the front doors during the exact window of time Daniel went missing. The town did not take it well. People whispered about police incompetence. They blamed the department for jumping too soon and others for not acting fast enough. They asked why someone like Lyle wasn't under supervision, why he was even allowed in public. He found his front windows smashed by the end of the week, his cart set on fire. Lyle vanished from Cedar Falls not long after. Some said he moved to Des Moines. Others believed he wandered into the woods and never came out. But his name remained, a scar in the town's memory, on more piece of a puzzle that refused to fit. The flyer paper faded faster than she expected. The first batch had been printed on bright yellow cardstock, missing child in bold black letters across the top, Daniel's school photo centered just below. He wore a blue flannel button-up, cheeks slightly flushed, as if the photographer had caught him mid-laugh. Margaret chose that photo because he looked happy in it, whole. But within days, the rain got to them. Wind peeled the corners. Some were torn down by teenagers, others shredded by time. She began carrying a staple gun and fresh copies in her purse. Every Thursday afternoon, like clockwork, Margaret walked the town. She made her way past the diner and the post office, up toward the community center bulletin board and the laundromat. Sometimes people offered to help. Most just watched her pass. Nobody stopped her. Nobody tried to talk her out of it. By the third month, the town had quieted. The rumors slowed. People folded the tragedy into their routine, talked about it less at barbershops and more in whispers, the way you talk about an illness someone might never recover from. But not Margaret. She refused to leave the house she and James had bought when Daniel was born. His room remained untouched. Dinosaurs still marched across the wallpaper in a long-forgotten parade. She made his bed every morning, dusted the dresser, turned on the nightlight each evening just in case. She recorded the names of every caller who reached out with a tip, dozens over the years. People who claimed to see Daniel in gas stations, on buses, even in a crowd shot from a news broadcast. She took each one seriously, kept a binder with times and dates and handwritten notes. She mailed letters to psychic hotlines. She joined missing child forums online when the internet came into her life like a slow-moving tide. James tried, at first. He helped with the flyers, drove her to interviews, showed up for community meetings. But the weight of it all pressed him flat. He began to drink quietly in the garage. Stopped shaving. Spoke less. Margaret didn't cry much anymore. She had moved past that. Grief had settled into her bones, familiar and heavy, like a winter coat she couldn't take off. But she never stopped searching. Someone knows something, she whispered to herself often. No one disappears like that. Not without help. And so every Thursday, she walked. With a staple gun, a stack of flyers, and a heart that refused to believe her son was gone forever. James Whittaker stopped talking about Daniel the week after Lyle Hargrove was released. He hadn't said much before then, not really. But something changed after the press conference. Something deep and unspoken, like a wire had been cut inside him, and everything just shut down. He still went to work, still shaved in the morning, still poured coffee into his travel mug and nodded goodbye to Margaret as he stepped out the door. But when he came home, he would sit for hours in the garage with the radio turned low, tuning the engine of a car that no longer needed tuning. The walls of their house began to echo with silence. Margaret talked to the flyers, to the tips on the phone, to herself. James talked to no one. At first, she tried to pull him back in. She'd press an article into his hand and say, "This boy was found after 10 years, in Texas. 10 years, James." He would nod, eyes on the page but not reading it. "That's good," he'd say, and hand it back. That was all. They sat side by side on the couch most nights, not touching. The TV flickered blue shadows on their faces. They rarely watched the same shows. James preferred the History Channel Now documentaries about distant wars, narrated in steady voices that never broke. Margaret missed his voice most in the mornings. Daniel used to wake them both up by crawling into their bed, all elbows and blankets and breath that still smelled like toothpaste. James had been the one to pull him close, whispering, "5 more minutes, kiddo." She remembered that voice, gentle, warm, still full of future. That version of James no longer existed. Their marriage began to stretch in quiet ways, small cracks, forgotten anniversaries, uneaten meals. Margaret noticed the way he left the kitchen when she entered, or how he flinched when she brought up Daniel's name. Not angry, just tired. They slept in the same bed but rolled to opposite edges. At night, Margaret would sometimes reach across the sheets and find only cold air. People in town began to say the Whittakers were coping differently. Some used the word divorcing when they thought she wasn't listening. But Margaret knew it wasn't that simple. Grief, she'd learned, was not one thing. It was 1,000 small isolations. And James had chosen silence. It became his armor, his hiding place. His answer to a question neither of them had dared to ask out loud. What if Daniel never comes home? By the end of the third year, the posters had begun to peel on their own. The ink had faded from yellow to bone white, Daniel's smile now more ghost than memory. Margaret still replaced them, though less often. Her printer had begun to stutter, low on toner, but she didn't bother fixing it. The town had stopped looking before she did. In the fall of 1999, on a cold Wednesday morning, a letter arrived from the Cedar Falls Police Department. It was brief, clinical. Words like, "exhausted all leads," and "no additional evidence." Near the bottom, in bold, "case status, inactive." Margaret stared at it for a long time, as if willing the ink to rearrange itself. The letter didn't say the case was closed. Not officially. But inactive meant what it always meant. The detectives had moved on. The meetings were over. Daniel's file would be boxed, labeled, and shelved on more folder gathering dust in a locked room no one visited unless pressed. Detective Rourke delivered the news personally later that week. He stood in their living room, hat in hand, eyes lined deeper than Margaret remembered. He didn't sit, didn't offer hope. "We'll still respond to tips," he said. "If anything comes in, we'll act on it." Margaret nodded once, not because she understood, but because there was nothing left to say. James wasn't there. He had started leaving before sunrise, driving aimlessly before work. He hadn't spoken Daniel's name in months. The last time he did, he'd whispered it in his sleep, a tremor in the dark that Margaret didn't dare acknowledge. The town noticed the silence. Reporters stopped calling. News stations moved on to newer tragedies. The back corner of Granger's Market reopened under a new name. Shoppers walked those aisles again, eyes still flicking to the spot where the mitten had been found, but no longer stopping. A new family moved into the house 2 doors down. Their daughter looked about Daniel's age, 6, maybe 7. Margaret watched her ride a pink bicycle up and down the street, wobbling, laughing, free. She wondered what Daniel would have looked like now. She tried to picture it. A taller version of the boy in the blue flannel, same crooked smile, same eyes. But every time she tried to see him older, her memory pulled her back to that day. The way his hand slipped from hers. The way the milk aisle felt like it had swallowed him whole. Cases don't close in a mother's mind. They linger, echoing. Even when the world decides to forget. Ed Kramer retired 3 years earlier than planned. He told people it was for his health, bad knees, too many years on concrete floors, stress from corporate restructuring. But those were just the words that made sense on paper. The real reason was buried in aisle 7, in the shadows of old security footage and a mother's hollow eyes. Ed had been the store manager of Granger's Market for nearly 2 decades. He knew the layout of every aisle like the back of his hand. Knew which freezers would ice over, which displays toppled if stacked too high, which employees snuck cigarettes out back. And he remembered the sound Margaret Whitaker made when she realized her son was gone. That sound had carved itself into the corners of his mind. It came back sometimes, especially in quiet moments. When the store was closed, when he was the last to lock up and the buzz of fluorescent lights was the only thing left in the building. He replayed that day more than he cared to admit. The way he waved to Daniel earlier, just a casual, "Hey buddy," as the boy walked in holding his mother's hand. The way he brushed off a beeping camera alert that morning, chalking it up to the usual glitch from last night's storm. He should have checked it. That's what he told himself every night. If he had checked the feed, if he had walked the aisles more thoroughly, if he had kept a better eye on the exits, on the people, on the strange cashier who quit the next day. The guilt came in waves, some sharp, some dull. He never said it out loud, not even to his wife. But every time he saw Margaret's face on flyers, on the news, in line buying milk years later, he felt it again. The police never blamed him. Neither did the town. But he could tell some people wondered how a child vanished on his watch, wondered why the cameras failed. He stayed on for a while, trying to keep the store running, trying to fill the aisles with enough noise and routine to forget. But the whispers followed him. The employees grew quiet when he passed. Customers lingered less. Eventually, he asked for early retirement, packed up his office in silence. left behind a store that had once felt like home and now felt like a wound that wouldn't close. On his last day, Ed stood alone in aisle 7, just for a moment. The shelf where the mitten had fallen had been replaced, restocked. But he still saw Itrid, small, alone on the floor. He turned off the lights and left without looking back. But the echoes followed him home. By the summer of 2018, the name Granger's Market had become more memory than landmark. The faded sign, once red and cheerful, had bleached to a sickly pink from years of sun and neglect. The parking lot had cracked in a spiderweb of weeds. Only the crows seemed loyal, circling the broken light poles like they had somewhere to be. The building had been empty for nearly a decade. No one wanted to lease a space haunted by a missing child and a town's unresolved grief. Developers came and went. Rumors stirred each time someone expressed interest, but nothing ever came of it until now. A national franchise, Freshco, bought the property in May. They were known for eco-conscious design, big windows, sleek produce displays, organic labels with price tags to match. The company sent a crew within weeks. By July, trucks had rolled in, demolition had begun, and the old grocery store was stripped bare like a carcass under a summer sun. Gone were the linoleum tiles, the sticky shelves, the water-stained ceiling panels that always leaked above aisle 5. New hardwood floors gleamed under LED lighting. The walls were painted bright green and white, as if color alone could erase the past. They knocked out the break room, tore down the old security office, installed self-checkouts where the registers used to stand. Even the freezer doors were replaced, modern glass humming with efficiency. The only thing that remained untouched was the building's shape-the-bones of the store, still recognizable to anyone who had lived in Cedar Falls long enough. Most didn't go near it. Parents who once paced that parking lot in search of a little red coat now drove across town for groceries. Teenagers told ghost stories about aisle 7. Employees whispered about that section of the back room where the cameras had failed, where the air always felt colder. Freshco didn't care. They weren't from Cedar Falls. They dealt in branding and profits. The grand reopening was scheduled for the fall. Balloons were ordered, coupons printed, a giant banner hung across the newly painted facade, locally grown, locally loved. But no one had asked Margaret Whitaker what she thought. She passed by once, just once, and stared through the tall, spotless windows at a gleaming aisle where Daniel had last stood. They could change the name, repaint the walls, polish every inch of that place until it sparkled. But no amount of renovation could scrub away what still lived behind the shelves. Sarah Jensen took the night shift because it paid 50 cents more per hour. That was all it came down to. She didn't like the hours 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., but the days were reserved for her mother's chemo appointments and the unpredictable waves of nausea that followed. Her mom couldn't be left alone, not anymore. And Sarah, just 19 and barely out of high school, had quietly stepped into the role no one else was around to fill. Freshco was her first real job. The uniform felt strange on her, an oversized green apron and a name tag that read Sarah J. in capital letters, like she might forget who she was. At night, the store was a different animal. The fluorescent lights hummed louder without the buzz of customers to drown them out. The doors rarely opened after midnight, save for the occasional insomniac or third shifter grabbing snacks and energy drinks. The real rhythm came from the hum of the refrigerators, the soft beeping of inventory scanners, and the static-filled pop songs piped in over the speakers. Sarah didn't mind the solitude. She preferred it. During the day, she moved through town like a ghost picking up prescriptions, refilling her mom's water glass, answering questions from the nurse with a polite nod. But at night, under the wash of white light and soft music, she felt like she had carved out a sliver of normal. Her coworkers came and went. The other night, employees mostly kept to themselves. There was Jason in produce, who always smelled like celery. Mia in stock, who never spoke unless absolutely necessary. And then there was the back corner where the shelf with laundry detergent met the cold drinks section, right where aisle 7 had once been. She hadn't known the store's history. Not at first. She heard about it from a customer, of all people a woman in her 40s, who whispered, "You know what happened here, right?" as Sarah rang up a box of cereal. The woman said it like sharing a ghost story, like an initiation. That night, Sarah went home and searched the name Daniel Whitaker. She read until the screen blurred. Articles, police reports, a photo of a little boy in a flannel shirt. When she returned to work the next evening, she passed aisle 7 slower than usual. Something about the way it felt under her feet off kilter, like a slant in the floor no one had corrected. She didn't know it yet, but Sarah was about to become the first person in 22 years to disturb the silence that had settled over that place, and what she would find behind the shelves would change everything. It happened just after 3:00 a.m., during one of those stretches when time seemed to thin out and the entire store felt like a waiting room for something that would never arrive. Sarah had been restocking canned soups. The new shipment came late, stacked in cardboard towers that leaned precariously by the swinging door to the stockroom. She moved slowly, methodically, slipping each can into place while her earbuds played a crime podcast she'd already heard twice. The store was empty. Not quiet, there was always some kind of noise, but hollow in a way that made her feel like she was moving through a photograph. She didn't mind it. It was better than home, where the silence meant something else entirely. She reached for a can on the top of the stack without looking, and bumped the edge of the old shelving unit beside her. It was a narrow, standalone piece the store used for promotional item soup mixes, gravy packets, whatever happened to be on sale that week. It had been there since her first day. It looked older than everything else, with small rusted bolts at the bottom and faded price stickers from brands no longer in circulation. The impact was light, but the entire structure wobbled with a sudden metallic groan. Before Sarah could catch it, the unit tipped sideways and slammed against the wall. Cans scattered across the floor like coins. "Crap," she muttered, yanking out her earbuds. As she knelt to gather the mess, something caught her eye, a line, thin and unnatural, running down the back wall behind where the shelf had stood. The impact had shifted one of the wooden wall panels, revealing a gap she hadn't noticed before. She leaned in. It wasn't much, a half-inch of darkness, just enough to see that the wall was not flush like the others. Curious, Sarah slipped her fingers into the crack and pulled gently. The panel moved. Not much, but enough. The wood shifted with a dry creak, revealing the edge of a hollow compartment. No wires, no insulation, just air and something else. Inside, wedged between 2 studs and wrapped in what looked like a disintegrating brown towel, was a small rusted tin box. Sarah froze. She looked around, suddenly aware of how alone she was. The sound of the fridge compressors seemed louder now, more deliberate. The box wasn't dusty. It had been placed there, hidden, and it hadn't moved in a very, very long time. Sarah didn't open the tin box right away. For a long moment, she just stared at it, crouched on the cold tile floor as the store hummed on around her, bright, empty, indifferent. The towel around it had mostly decayed, clinging in damp strands like cobwebs. The metal was discolored, its edges flaked with rust. She didn't want to touch it, not with her bare hands, so she slipped her sleeve over her fingers and lifted it gently. It was heavier than it looked. She set it down carefully, listening to the faint rattle inside. Her heart beat louder than the store's overhead music. The box had no lock, just a tight-fitting lid sealed by time. She worked it open slowly, expecting nothing and everything at once. The lid gave with a reluctant pop, sending a tiny cloud of dust into the air. Inside, pressed tightly together, were 3 things. The first was a crumpled photograph. She unfolded it cautiously, smoothing it against the tile with shaking hands. It was faded, grainy, black and white. A young boy stood in the center, no older than 6. He wore a puffy winter coat, a red mitten visible on one hand, the same mitten she had seen in the articles. Daniel Whitaker. His eyes were wide, not smiling. Behind him was the vague silhouette of an adult, face obscured by a shadow, one arm extended toward Daniel's shoulder but not quite touching. The second item was a receipt. Printed in faint purple ink on aging thermal paper, it was barely legible, but the name Granger's Market was clear, followed by a date, March 2, 1996. Sarah stared at it, pulse quickening. The timestamp read 2:16 p.m. She swallowed hard. That was the exact time listed in every article about Daniel's disappearance. The last moment he was seen. The receipt showed a short list of items: a soda, a pack of gum, a candy bar. Paid in cash. No name. But scribbled on the back, in faint blue ink, were the initials O.G. The third item was a sticker partially peeled, the kind handed to children after shopping trips. It read, "I was a helper today," with a cartoon bear giving a thumbs up. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders like wet cement. She sat back on her heels, still staring at the contents spread out before her, and whispered the boy's name out loud for the first time. Daniel. Somehow, after 22 years, the store had spoken, and now it was her turn to listen. Sarah held the photograph in both hands, careful not to let it tear along the soft creases that had formed from years of being folded, hidden, forgotten. The boy in the image was unmistakable, even though she had never met him. Daniel Whitaker. The same child from the newspaper clippings, from the missing posters, still found in the dark corners of online forums. Same fine, light hair that curled slightly at the ends. Same round cheeks, though here, in this image, they were not lifted in a smile. He looked startled, or maybe just uncertain, like he hadn't been told they were taking his picture. He stood stiffly in the frame of the photograph, small shoulders hunched. One red mitten clutched his right hand. The other hand hung at his side, nearly touching the thigh of someone standing beside him. That someone... Sarah squinted, but the adult figure was mostly lost to shadow. The image had been taken indoors, that much she could tell. Fluorescent lighting cast a slight glare on the back wall, maybe a break room or storage area. But the tall figure next to Daniel was turned just enough that their face slipped behind the edge of darkness. Just the chin and a partial cheekbone were visible. The shape of the mouth, lips, neither smiling nor frowning, just there. The arm was the most telling part. It hung stiff at the side, hand half reached toward the boy but not touching him. The fingertips curved awkwardly, as if caught mid-motion. There was something in the body language that made Sarah's stomach twist, not in the way the hand was held, but in how Daniel leaned slightly away from it. Subtle, but there. A detail that might not have mattered to anyone else, but to Sarah, who had spent years reading her mother's expressions during chemo appointments, gauging every blink, every shift in posture. It screamed. The boy wasn't comfortable. This wasn't a family photo. It wasn't a memory. It was documentation, proof of something, or maybe a trophy. She turned the photo over. The back was blank. No date, no writing, no fingerprint smudges, just the faded yellow of old photo paper. Sarah stared at it for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. When she finally moved, it was to fold the photo carefully and slide it back into the box. Her hands shook as she closed the lid. Whatever had happened here, someone had wanted it to stay buried. And yet now it was surfacing, one secret at a time. Sarah sat in the break room long after her shift had ended, the rusted tin box tucked tightly in her backpack, her hands still tingling with adrenaline. The store was waking up around early morning stalkers arriving, music changing from night loop to daytime playlist, the smell of baking bread starting to drift from the bakery. She hadn't slept. She didn't want to. The receipt was burned into her mind. March 2, 1996, 2:16 p.m. Candy bar. Soda. Gum. Scribbled initials. OG. It wasn't much, but it was something. A timestamp that matched the moment Daniel Whitaker vanished, a trail that had sat dormant for over 2 decades, waiting. Sarah logged into the store's computer system under the guise of reviewing shift schedules. She wasn't supposed to have access to the archived receipts, but an older assistant manager once showed her how to access the back-end logs. "Just in case you ever need to look up a transaction for a customer," he'd said. She clicked through outdated interfaces until she found the archives labeled Legacy Systems, Granger's. A single server, slow to respond, but intact. She input the date. 3/2/1996. A list of receipts appeared, basic entries, mostly missing item names but retaining totals, times, and employee ID numbers. It was like peering through a keyhole into the past. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled to 2:16 p.m. There it was. Transaction, $11,765. Cash only. Total, 1.62. Cashier ID, OG, 14. It was real. It wasn't some hoax or prank. Someone had bought those items, gum, soda, a candy barat, the exact time Daniel disappeared, and the cashier had been someone with the initials OG. She opened a second window and accessed the old employee roster. Most names were buried under years of turnover, but with enough digging, she found it. Griggs, Owen, cashier. Start date, August 1995. Resigned, March 3, 1996. The day after Daniel vanished. Sarah leaned back in her chair, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Owen Griggs. She'd never heard his name before. He wasn't mentioned in any articles, no police reports she'd read, no interviews. But he was there. On the day Daniel vanished. On the register at 2:16 p.m., and he quit without notice the next morning. She didn't know who he was yet, but she would. Because someone had to finish what no one else had. Someone had to follow the trail. The name Owen Griggs meant nothing to Sarah at first. Just a few lines of data buried in the store's ancient employee database. Hire date, role, termination, no address, no photo, no obituary. Just a name and a gap, like someone had drawn a single line through him and erased the rest. But something about it felt too clean, too convenient. A cashier working the exact time Daniel disappeared. A man whose initials matched the back of the receipt. A name never once mentioned in any article, any interview, any press release. Thengone. She searched the local directories. No Griggs listed in Cedar Falls. She widened the search to nearby towns. Nothing. A few Griggs scattered across the state, but no Owens. Not of the right age. Not with employment history that matched. She found a single classified ad from 1995 in the Cedar Falls Gazette. Now hiring for seasonal cashier staff at Granger's Market. Apply within. No experience necessary. He would have been a teenager then. Early 20s maybe. A name at the bottom of the scheduling list. The kind of employee who clocks in, clocks out, goes home without ever becoming part of the team. Sarah pressed deeper. County records. State job registries. Nothing. Not even a forwarding address. It was as if Owen Griggs had slipped out of the store the night Daniel vanished and taken the rest of himself with him. She found an old manager's logbook buried in a file cabinet near the back office. Pages yellowed with time, ink faded but legible under fluorescent light. March 3, 1996. Griggs didn't show. No call. Left apron in break room. Cleaned out locker. She flipped back to March 2. No notes, no incidents. Nothing unusual logged. That absence felt louder than any entry. Someone would have seen him. Someone had to have noticed. But 22 years was a long time for memories to fade, for suspicion to calcify into folklore. And no one remembered the boy behind the register. Sarah printed his name on a piece of paper, taped it above her bed. It hung there next to the photo of Daniel, as if they belonged together, two ghosts circling the same vanishing point. She didn't believe in coincidences. The boy had disappeared. And so had the cashier. And now, all these years later, it was Sarah who was finally asking why. Sarah hadn't expected the librarian to remember him. She went in with low hopes, clutching a note with Owen Griggs' name on it and a folder of printed articles that led nowhere. The Cedar Falls Public Library was mostly empty that afternoon, sunlight stretching thin across the tiled floor, dust floating like forgotten things in the air. But the librarian, an older woman with sharp eyes and a name tag that read Karen, paused when Sarah asked. "Owen Griggs," she said slowly. That name hasn't come up in years. Karen disappeared into the back, returning 10 minutes later with a box labeled Local Archives, 1980s, 90s. Inside were yearbooks, newspaper clippings, and old community reports photocopied onto fading sheets of paper. And there he was. A middle school yearbook from 1990. Fifth row, fourth face, Owen Griggs. He was thin, all bones and sunken eyes. His smile was lopsided, like it had been forced out at the last second. He didn't look into the camera. Sarah ran her finger over the name below his photo. She flipped through the pages. He was in the back too in the group shot labeled Foster Outreach Program. Karen spoke gently behind her. He was in and out of homes. I remember hearing that he'd been placed at the Mulberry House up on Elm Street, back when it was still running. Hard place, never stayed long. Sarah scribbled the name down, Mulberry House. She left the library and drove past the edge of town where Mulberry once stood. The building was boarded up now, graffiti tagging the doors, windows busted in. The old sign still leaned against the front porch. Youth Transitional Living Center. She sat in her car, staring at it, imagining a boy like Owen, standing on that porch in winter, hands in his pockets, watching other kids get picked up by families that never came for him. She called the county office, pretending to be a student doing a research paper. A tired clerk confirmed that Owen had cycled through multiple foster homes between 1987 and 1995. No known family. No next of kin. After 18, he aged out, got a job. And then, like the boy he once watched disappear, Owen vanished too. Sarah looked at his yearbook photo again that night, and for the first time she felt something besides suspicion. She felt pity. Because whoever Owen Griggs became after that March afternoon in 1996, the boy in that photo had already been disappearing long before Daniel ever did. Margaret hadn't stepped foot inside that building since the day it swallowed her son. 22 years was a long time to avoid a single address, especially in a town as small as Cedar Falls. She'd driven past it now and then, of course on her way to the pharmacy, or when she took the long route home just to avoid the silence waiting there. But she never looked directly at it. It had become a shadow she recognized by shape alone. Until now. The phone call came from a girl named Sarah. Young. Quiet. Her voice trembled a little as she explained what she'd found. The box. The photo. The receipt. And Daniel. Margaret sat at the kitchen table while Sarah spoke, her hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't interrupt, she barely breathed. When the call ended, she drove. No coat, no makeup, just keys, shoes, and the worn photograph of Daniel she kept tucked in her wallet. The parking lot looked the same, and somehow it didn't. The Freshco banner was bright and clean, a sharp contrast to the memories that clung to the cracked pavement beneath her feet. She stood outside for a long time, unsure if she could cross the threshold. The automatic doors, now silent and newer, opened without hesitation. Margaret stepped inside. Everything had changed. The floors gleamed. The shelves were wide and modern. There were floral displays where the cereal aisle used to be. It didn't smell like oranges and wax anymore. It smelled like lavender cleaning spray and something sterile. She walked slowly, passing new signs and unfamiliar aisles. When she reached the far corner where aisle 7 had once been, she stopped. The space felt too open now, like something had been scooped out of it. Sarah met her there. The girl looked younger in person, hair tied back, dark circles under her eyes. She didn't say anything at first. Just held out the tin box wrapped in a soft cloth, like she was handing over something sacred. Margaret took it, her fingers brushing the metal lid. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she looked around the store that had become legend and ghost story. "I used to hold his hand right there," she said, pointing to the polished tile. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shined. "We were getting milk." Sarah didn't speak. She didn't need to. Together, they stood in the place where everything had ended, and maybe final where something was about to begin again. It was a deed transfer that pulled the case out of the dark. An old property record, nearly lost in a misfiled drawer at the Cedar County Recorder's Office, surfaced thanks to a real estate intern cataloging backlogs for digitization. A house on Grinnell Ridge Road, rural, quiet, surrounded by cornfields, and a line of wood sold in 1,997 for cash. Buyer's name, Michael Owens. But the signature on the purchase form wasn't quite right. The handwriting looked rushed, uncertain, as if the writer had to remind himself which name he was using. Detective Larson caught the detail while reviewing materials forwarded from Sarah Jensen's findings. The timing was too perfect. The sale was finalized just 6 months after Daniel's disappearance. The buyer had no prior credit history, no listed employer, a ghost with a bank envelope. Larson circled the address in red ink. The next day, 2 cruisers and a black SUV rolled slowly down the long gravel road that led to the house at the edge of Grinnell Ridge. The mailbox leaned to one side. The numbers were hand-painted, faded, nearly white. From a distance, the house looked abandoned, sagging porch steps, shutters askew. The yard overgrown with yellow grass and wind-scattered trash. But up close, the details didn't add up. The padlock on the back door was new. The curtains inside had been drawn recently. Neighbors were few and far between, and most hadn't seen the house's occupant in years, if ever. He was quiet, one recalled. Kept to himself. Had a car, but only drove it at night. No trouble. When police pried the door open, the air inside was still, heavy. A sharp chemical smell lingered near the back room, where bleach had soaked into the hardwood. The furniture was minimal. A single chair, a mattress on the floor, an empty fish tank. But in the farthest room, what had once been a child's bedroom, there were toys. Neatly arranged, untouched by dust. On the windowsill sat a small action figure, one leg broken off and carefully taped back on. In the closet they found an old jacket, tiny, red, and lined with a name tag. Daniel. The photos on the wall had been removed, but faint rectangles of sun-faded outlines remained. Outside, Larson stood under the eaves, staring at the field beyond. The case file he held now had a new name on it. Michael Owenson, alias for Owen Griggs. After 22 years, the story was shifting, and the house, silent all this time, had finally begun to speak. They found the hidden room on the second day. The first sweep had turned up nothing more than what the report called, concerning remnants, child-sized clothing, a few toys too clean for an otherwise dusty home, and the unmistakable presence of bleach in the air. But it wasn't until a crime scene tech noticed a seam in the baseboard behind the bedroom closet that everything changed. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. A section of wall where the plaster was newer, just a shade too smooth. When they pried it open, it gave with a reluctant groan, revealing a narrow crawl space that stretched deeper than the house should have allowed. Inside was silence. And then, slowly, the sound of breath caught in the throats of those who entered. It wasn't a crawl space at all, it was a room. 10 feet by 10, sealed off completely. No windows. One low-hanging bulb with a pull string, swaying gently from their movement. The walls were painted sky blue, though the color had faded into something more like ash. The floor was covered in thin carpet, worn but clean. Someone had taken care of this room, maintained it. Along one wall, children's books had been stacked neatly into piles. Titles like Goodnight Moon and Where the Wild Things Are. Pages dog-eared, some covers warped by what looked like damp hands. Near the books sat a small red chair. Next to it, a toy chest overflowing with items that had no business surviving in such condition: plastic figurines, rubber dinosaurs, a wooden puzzle with one piece missing. But what made the room unbearable were the drawings. They covered the far wall, taped edge to edge, curling at the corners. Crayon and marker, some with stickers pressed unevenly into the corners. They were simple: a house, a boy, a tall figure standing beside him, a sun with too many rays. But some showed other things. A boy behind a door, A boy with a red X over his mouth. A boy sitting alone, next to a clock with no hands. The final drawing, stuck near the floor, showed a house at night. No lights, no stars. And in the window, 2 eyes. Wide, watching. Detective Larson didn't say a word. He just stood there, taking it all in, the weight of it pressing against his chest like stone. This was no ordinary hiding place. This was a life, boxed in and buried behind a wall. And Daniel Whitaker had lived here. It was tucked beneath the mattress, inside a worn shoebox wrapped in a child's bedsheet. The rest of the tapes were labeled plainly Danny 1, Danny 2, up through Danny 9. But it was 7 that made the room go quiet. A crime scene tech found it while photographing the bedding. He called for Detective Larson, his voice steadier than his hands. Larson took the cassette carefully, as though it might disintegrate in his palm. The handwriting on the label was blocky, uneven, written in thick black marker. It looked like a child had written it, but the 7 was oddly precise. They didn't play it in the house. Later, back at the station, Larson sat in an evidence room the size of a small cell, a cassette player resting on the table between him and a department psychologist. The air was thick. No one spoke as he pressed play. There was a click, a hiss of static, and then a voice. High-pitched, young. Daniel. At first, he was singing, softly, a lullaby, maybe? The words were muffled, uncertain, but the tone was unmistakably childlike. He was trying to soothe himself. The melody wavered, off-key, in the most heartbreaking way. Then came silence. And after a few seconds, his voice again. "I want to go home," Daniel said. The words were spoken slowly, like he had practiced them. "I want to go home now, please. I was good today." Another pause. The sound of breathing. A sniffle. "I did everything you said." There was movement, then faint shuffling, like fabric brushing the microphone, and then another voice, distant but male, entering the background. "Quiet time, Danny." The child's voice vanished. The tape clicked off. Detective Larson sat very still. The psychologist beside him pressed a tissue to her mouth. Neither moved for several minutes. It wasn't just the words that haunted them. It was the tone, the resignation. Daniel wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He was pleading the way only a child does quietly, believing if he asked kindly enough, someone might listen. Someone might open the door. Outside the room, officers lined the hallway in silence, waiting to hear if the tape was what they feared it was. It was. Danny 7 wasn't evidence. It was a message. A whisper from behind the wall. And after 22 years, it had finally been heard. The envelope arrived by courier, hand-delivered from the State Forensic Lab with a red priority stamp bleeding across the front. Detective Larson didn't open it right away. He stared at it for a full minute, thumb tracing the seal like a prayer. When he finally tore it open, the paper inside felt heavier than it should have, like it already knew what it was about to say. The results weren't long, a page and a half typed in clinical font. But buried in the precision was the truth they had all been circling for weeks. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from hair samples recovered from the hidden room at 481 Grinnell Ridge Road is a conclusive match to Margaret Whitaker. Daniel. It was him. He had lived there. The boy who vanished into thin air at age 6 had not disappeared into smoke. He had been hidden, kept, silenced. And he had survived for a while. Margaret was called first. The moment the words left Larson's mouth, she didn't say anything, not at first. Just breathed, deep and slow, like she was trying to hold something inside that threatened to spill out. "He was alive," she whispered. "He was alive after." There was no comfort in it, no justice, just the cold reality of time that could not be reclaimed. The room in the house had been a prison disguised as protection. The toys, the books, the drawing set was all a shell, a carefully arranged performance to maintain the illusion of care. But now, science had stripped the illusion bare. Daniel had lived in that room. had drawn on those walls, had shed the very hair that lay tucked in the fibers of the old carpet. Officers returned to the house with fresh gloves and solemn eyes. Every scrap of evidence was now part of a timeline. Sarah Jensen was brought into the station again, her hands still visibly shaking when she was shown the report. She looked at the signature at the bottom, clinical, official, cold, and then she looked at the photograph she'd found in the wall. The boy in the photo had been alive. Not just a face frozen in 1996. She whispered, almost to herself, "He waited." Across town, Margaret sat in her living room with the report folded on her lap. She stared out the window for a long time, not at anything in particular, just the world, still moving. Outside, children laughed, birds sang. And somewhere in that noise, something inside her finally began to break. The neighbor's name was Glenna Avery, 82 years old and mostly housebound, her memory a mixture of sharp edges and fog. She lived in the farmhouse just across the field from Grinnell Ridge, close enough to see the house through her living room window when the trees were bare in winter. Her house sat quiet most days, radio humming low, birds at the feeder, the slow tick of a grandfather clock echoing through the rooms. She hadn't meant to come forward. She never had. Not until she saw the news, on television, images of the hidden room, of the red jacket, of the boy's name being spoken again after all these years. She called the non-emergency line late in the evening. The operator nearly dismissed her, but something in her voice, fragile, trembling, made them pass it along. Detective Larson drove out the next day, parking in a gravel driveway softened with moss. Glenna met him at the door with a walker and eyes rimmed red. "I didn't know what I saw," she said, again and again, as she led him to the living room and sat in a chair worn smooth with time. Larson didn't press, he just listened. "It was maybe 2 years after he moved in," she began. "The man Owen? He told me his name was Michael Owens. Said he wanted to be left alone. And he was polite, you know. Quiet. Paid for firewood in cash. Never gave me trouble." She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around a bony finger. "But once," she said, "during the spring I saw someone in his attic window." She pointed toward the field, where the house sat just beyond a line of fence posts. A little face, a boy, just standing there, not waving, just watching. Her voice grew quieter. "I asked him about it a few days later. 'Owens,' I said, 'didn't know you had a boy.' And he smiled. 'Tight, like it hurt. Said the kid was his son. Said the boy didn't like people much.'" She shook her head slowly. "I didn't think anything of it after that. What was I supposed to do? A man and his son living quiet. I thought he just wanted peace." Larson said nothing for a long moment. "You understand what you saw, Mrs. Avery?" She nodded. "I saw a boy," she said softly, "and I did nothing." The silence that followed felt heavier than any words. Because now, finally, the town was beginning to understand what it had missed all along. It was the dog that found it. A cadaver dog named Scout, brought in with the second wave of forensic teams. The house at Grinnell Ridge had already given up its biggest secret, the hidden room, but the yard hadn't been fully searched. Not yet. The shed behind the house leaned slightly to the left, its roof rusted and vines clawing at the siding. Nothing inside but a broken lawnmower, some old rope, and boxes swollen from years of damp. But the ground behind it, just a few yards from the tree, line told a different story. Scout froze near a patch of soil that looked at first glance like any other part of the overgrown yard. But the grass didn't grow quite the same. It came in thinner, weaker. A subtle dip marked the earth like a scar someone had tried to forget. The shovel broke ground around 2:00 p.m. By 2:15 they found the bones. They came up slowly, small, delicate, the curve of a rib, the gentle slope of a jaw no larger than a teacup. There was no coffin, just earth and time. Near the skull, nestled in the soil like it had been placed there with care, was a toy police car. One door broken, the red paint chipped away by weather and age. And beside it, half wrapped in plastic, was the second red mitten. The match. The one Margaret had never stopped searching for. Detective Larson stood at the edge of the perimeter tape, his arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't speak as the forensic team worked. He didn't need to. Everyone there knew what this meant. Daniel hadn't just lived in that house. He had died there. There would be tests, of course. DNA, bone analysis, timelines to confirm. But they didn't need a lab to tell them the truth they already saw, written in dirt and silence. Margaret was notified that evening. She didn't cry. Not at first. She only asked one question. Was he alone? And when they told her about the toy car, about the mitten, about how someone, whoever buried him, had placed those things beside him, she nodded once. He loved that car, she said, took it everywhere, said it made him feel safe. The wind picked up that night. The trees bent low, as if the earth itself were mourning. After 22 years of waiting, of searching, of wondering, Daniel was found. Not in the way anyone had hoped. But at last, he would be brought home. The results came back in the middle of a cold October morning. The letter was formal. Clinicolin official statement from the coroner's office confirming what everyone already knew in their bones. The remains found behind the shed at Grinnell Ridge were Daniel Whitaker's. The DNA matched. The dental impressions aligned. Margaret had prepared herself for this moment 1,000 times in her mind. She'd imagined the phone call, the words, the wait. But when it finally came, it didn't land like a hammer. It fell quiet, like snow. She thanked the woman on the phone, wrote the date on a piece of paper beside her, and sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that went cold in her hands. That Saturday, the town gathered. Not in the church, not in the cemetery, but at the store. Freshco closed its doors for the first time since reopening. The manager, eyes wet, had offered the space freely. It felt right, somehow. To honor Daniel, not in some distant place, but at the threshold of where his story had been both stolen and returned. A simple memorial. No microphones, no speeches, just people. Margaret stood near aisle 7, where someone had placed white flowers along the tile floor in the shape of a heart. At its center sat a framed photo of Danieltha, one with the blue flannel and the crooked smile. Sarah was there too, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, her green apron folded neatly in her hands. She'd already turned in her resignation. The store had changed for her. It wasn't just a job anymore. It had become a place that breathed with memory. It had asked something of her, and now she had nothing left to give it. After the service, she walked Margaret to her car. "You found him," Margaret said. Her voice didn't waver. "You gave me the part of him I thought I'd never hold again." Sarah didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. From that day on, she visited Margaret often. Sometimes they sat on the porch. Other times, they sifted through old photographs in shoeboxes. They didn't always speak. Some afternoons passed in silence, just the rustle of trees and the clink of teacups. But it was a different kind of silence, not the hollow, aching kind that came after loss. This was quieter, softer. The kind that only comes when something has finally been returned. When a mother, after 22 years, can say without question, "My son is home,"